Okay. Hey guys. Now why this is being weird. Okay. Hey. So, oh shoot. Forgot to get the right book out. Got my water. My phone on Do Not Disturb. Not get the right book. Okay. Sorry, I use my books to prop up my laptop. That way it's not like you're looking just at my double chin. So yeah. Okay. Where did we leave off? Let me look at my notes. I feel like some of the way we've been doing note-taking has been a little long-winded, and I think you guys can read for yourselves unless you really want me to read out loud, which is fine, but I think I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that one. Okay, my book notes. I haven't shown you guys this, but I have notes for class, and I have notes for my book taking, and I keep them separate for a reason because I want to know what it is that I'm typing that is mine. Now I could go and type in afterwards when we go to class all of his stuff in a different color, like blue or whatever, but I just find it easier to do it this way. And that way when I'm in the classroom, anything that I'm typing is supplemental to what I've already learned from reading through the first time. So that might be something you want to consider doing. Okay, so I feel like I didn't get much out of what we were studying last time. So I think I'm going to revise just by reading it again, just to catch up. Okay. Right, so we talked about one important condition is the level of correspondence or similarity between attitude measures and behaviors. We talked about Lapierre and Isaac Ajzen and Martin Fishbein. And then they said the more specific the initial attitude question was, the better it predicted the behavior. We talked about his theory of planned behavior being a theory that attitudes towards a specific behavior combined with subjective norms and perceived control to influence a person's actions. And I said that there were 4 points to this. Behavior is influenced less by general attitudes than by specific behavior. So that's kind of a backwards way of saying behavior is influenced by specific behavior. Subjective norms are the specific attitudes that they're talking about. That attitudes only give rise to behavior when we perceive the behavior to be within our control. And then the fourth, that although attitudes contribute to intention to behave in a particular manner, they often do not follow through with their intentions. So it indicates intention, but not actual follow through. All right. This general approach, which places the link between attitudes and behavior within a broader context, has successfully been used to predict a wide range of practical behaviors. I give a whole bunch of examples. I think that might be nice to type up. So when I go through and type that, I will add that. All right, and then they go over the strength of the attitude. According to the theories of reasoned action and planned behavior, specific attitudes combine with social factors to produce behavior. Sometimes attitudes have more influence on that behavior than do other factors, and sometimes they have less. So they give an example that I really liked. About attitudes that are held with great confidence, but that are difficult to change. Where was it? Oh, yes. Political activists have very fiery passions, is what they put. I didn't highlight it, but I liked that example. I may put that in my notes too. So they talk about the 3 physiological factors that distinguish between strongest and weakest attitudes. And they said that the attitudes that we most passionately hold on to are 1, directly affected by our own self-interests, deeply held philosophical, political, or religious values, and 3 are concerned with our close friends, family, and social in-groups. I feel like all of those are fairly interrelated, but I like that they've spread it out or portioned it out very specifically, because what is my own self-interest might be a little different than my own religion. I think we've talked about this in class before, where he mentioned you could be Catholic, but you may also have been in a situation where you disagree with a particular stance that the Catholic faith has on a issue, because you went through that issue and it affected you in such a way that made you feel like you wanted to have a different opinion of the Catholic Church, or politically, same thing. And I like that they've also said, just because you have a philosophical position or a religious value, that may sometimes be different from your friends or your immediate family or your immediate social group. So I like that they've distinguished and parsed that out, which is why I highlighted it. But anyway. All right, research shows when people surrounded by others who are like-minded, the attitudes they hold are stronger and more resistant to change. And we talked about that in the last live stream, about how you can create an echo chamber, so I won't go over that again. People tend to behave in ways that are consistent with their attitudes when they're well-informed. So they used the example of, if you've done quite a bit of research before forming a decision, you tend to follow through on behavior to support that, more so than just someone who's like, yeah, I vote Republican, or yeah, I'm totally for the environment. The people who do more research and are more informed about why they feel specifically rooted in a particular political affiliation or social issue that they engage in, tend to not just say it, they tend to also act on that more. So those opinions tend to, how do you call that? Translate into behavior when they're more informed. And then the strength of an attitude is indicated not only by the amount of information on which it is based, but also how that information is acquired. It shows that attitudes are more stable and more predictive of behavior when they're born of direct personal experience than when based on indirect or secondhand information. That one's self-explanatory. An attitude can be strengthened, ironically, by attack against it. We talked about that as well. People who feel like they've survived an attack on their personal opinion, even if it's with well-informed, whatever, will hold on to that idea even more because of the ability to justify or whatever. It'll change their degree of certainty. Yeah. All right, so yeah. think that's where I stopped because I was just having such a hard time focusing last time. So let's dive in. All right. Where am I trying to get to today? I'm trying to get to, just in this mini session, I think I'm going to try to get a few more pages. Okay. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to read that last paragraph again so that I can get in the mindset for the next paragraph. Third, an attitude can be strengthened ironically by an attack against it from a persuasive message. According to Zachary Tormala and Richard Petty in 2002, people hold attitudes with varying degrees of certainty, and they become more confident in their positions after they successfully resist changing that attitude in response to a persuasive communication. In one study, researchers confronted university students with an unpopular proposal to add senior comprehensive exams to a graduation requirement. Each student read a pro-exam argument that was described as strong or weak, after which they were asked to write down counter-arguments and indicate their attitude toward the policy. The result, students who continue to oppose the policy despite reading what they thought to be a strong argument became even more certain of their opinion. I have some qualms with that specific, definition, operational definitions on that. I have some issues with, but that's another point. Anyway, the fourth key factor is that strong attitudes are highly accessible to awareness, which means they are quickly and easily brought to mind. To return to our earlier examples, computer jocks think often about their computer preferences, and political activists think often about their allegiances to political parties. It turns out that many attitudes, not just those we feel strongly about, easily pop into mind, I think, by the mere sight or even just the mention of an attitude object. When this happens, the attitude can trigger behavior in a quick or spontaneous way by leading us to think carefully about how we feel and how to respond. Okay, so I think I'm going to highlight strong attitudes are highly accessible to awareness, meaning they're quickly and easily brought to mind. Just at the mention, can trigger behavior in a quick, spontaneous way. Yeah. All right. Next section, attitudes in a cultural context. Okay, so Bo Kyung Park and colleagues in 2013 tell this story. In the hallways of a local library in Korea, it is not unusual to see individuals in front of a vending machine wavering between two beverage options for a while, eventually making a choice by doing eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Thus, a vending machine in the library has the unique option called random. If you press this option, the machine will give you a Coke or Sprite randomly. Such an idea may sound hilarious or absurd to North Americans. However, this vending machine anecdote nicely illustrates a cultural difference between preference and choice. In Western cultures that value independence, it is common to see our attitudes as a part of who we are, embodying our own values, our own tastes, preferences, and personalities. Making choices is an exercise of our attitudes. From that perspective, it's natural to expect that our likes and dislikes will remain relatively constant over time and predictive of behavior. In many East Asian cultures, however, where personal independence is less highly valued, a person's attitude may not show this level of consistency. Indeed, Hilla Reimer, or Reimer, depending if she's German, and colleagues in 2014 observed that whereas Western views of the attitudes are often person-centric in these ways, in other parts of the world, attitudes depend more on contextual factors such as social norms, other people's expectations, roles, and obligations. Okay, so that's a lot. I read 2 paragraphs. I think the first one was pretty introductory though, so I don't think it needs highlighting, especially because the next paragraph summarizes what they're trying to say about the information given in that paragraph. So I'm going to highlight the first one. In Western culture, that value independence, that whole sentence. Actually, I take that back. Culture difference regarding preference and choice. I'm just going to highlight that little tiny part. Okay, so we highlighted in Western cultures, and then I'm going to highlight in many East Asian cultures, however, where personal independence is valued less. Yeah. I think, dang, I take that back. Instead of highlighting those 2, I would highlight whereas Western views are often person-centric in these ways, in other parts of the world, attitudes depend more on contextual factors, such as, all the way to the end. I think that sentence summarizes those 2 paragraphs entirely. Yeah, we don't need those 2. Okay, that's a better summary. All right. Sometimes we go back. It's fine. Okay, so next paragraph. To the extent that norms can change over time and across situations, people in non-Western cultures may exhibit less consistency in their attitudes. Research by Wilkin and others in 2011 supports this hypothesis. In one study, American and Japanese participants were asked to report on their favorite musical artists, TV shows, restaurants, and other preferences, and to estimate how long these preferences have lasted. Overall, the Japanese participants reported liking their favorites for a shorter period of time than Americans did. In a second study, participants evaluated how trendy various items were, such as iPod, Harry Potter books, and the Wii. When questioned about these same items a year later, American participants stayed relatively consistent in their evaluations, but Japanese participants reported significant changes in their attitude. Yeah, I think the best one for this one is the very first one. To the extent that norms can change over time and across situations, people in non-Western cultures may exhibit less consistency in their attitudes. Baby? Yes. Você terminou? Ok, você precisa escrever a letra para tia Arti. I left you a little note on how you should write the letter. You need to do all 5 of those things in your sorry letter. So yes, ma'am. Ok, eu vou checar daqui a pouquinho, viu? Diga sim, senhora. Sorry, parenting. Yay! Okay, so if attitudes in Western cultures are consistent parts of a person, it stands to reason that our attitudes and behavior would be highly correlated. But does it also stand to reason that attitudes would be less predictive of behavior in non-Western cultures, where context also matters? In one study, Krishna Savani and colleagues in 2008 asked North American and Indian participants to rate how much they liked everyday items, watches, shoes, and shirts. Later, when they had to choose one item for a set of four, from a set of four, Indians were less likely than Americans to choose the watch, shoes, or shirts they said that they had liked the best. For Indian participants, their choices presumably depended on factors other than personal preference. Interesting. That paragraph sets up a question. I don't think they really fully answered it. Let's read the next paragraph to see if there's some context in there. So is the link between attitudes and behavior stronger in some cultures than others? Kimin Eom, or Eom, and colleagues in 2016 asked this question by testing the link between concern for environmental issues, such as global warming, and support for environmental action, such as a tax to reduce pollution. Using a survey of 47 countries, these researchers found that environmental attitudes predicted support for environmental action in individualistic cultures, but not in collectivist ones. For example, they found that while environmental concern predicted environmentally friendly consumer behavior in the United States, an independent culture perceived social norms predicted, that doesn't make sense. For example, they found that while environmental concern predicted environmentally friendly consumer behavior in the United States, an independent culture, perceived social norms predicted behavior in Japan, a collectivist culture. This cross-cultural pattern of correlations between environmental attitudes and action is shown in figure 6.6. Okay, so I'm gonna look that up because sometimes I'm more visual than not. All right. Country scaled for individualism. So United States, Australia is super individualistic. Indonesia, Trinidad, Tobago, Burkina, Ghana, they're all on the super low scale. Correlation between environmental concern and support for action. Okay. Yuki. No, ma'am. Evelyn, can you let the dog out, please? Evelyn. Yes. Thank you. Can you go outside with her for a minute? Yeah. Vai. Rápido. Thank you. Okay. Sorry. It's that witching hour when you try to do things and then nothing works because everybody's blowing up your phone or everybody's after you. Yay. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna finish up. I'll look at that later. Okay. So yeah. All right. So they're summing it up in this last paragraph. So let's read that last paragraph. To sum up, research on the link between people's attitudes and behavior leads to an important conclusion. Our evaluations of an object do not always determine our actions because other factors must be taken into account. However, when attitudes are strong and specific to a behavior, at least in Western cultures, the effects are beyond dispute. Under these conditions, voting is influenced by political opinions. Consumer purchasing is affected by product attitudes. Racial discrimination is rooted in feelings of prejudice. Attitudes can be important determinants of behavior. The question is, how can attitudes be changed? Like what they did there, trying to cliffhanger you into the next section. Okay, so I think we need to highlight our evaluations of an object do not always determine our actions because other factors must be taken into account. And I think I'm going to go back to the paragraph before where it says using a survey of 47 countries, they found, I think I'm going to highlight Environmental attitudes predicted support for environmental active action in individualistic cultures, but not collectivist ones. And this cultural pattern of correlations, no, I don't know how to sum up. There's too much. Let me sum up. I think context matters is the best way to sum up this whole thing. Cultural context matters. I'm just going to highlight that and call it a day, because these 3 paragraphs are all dealing with this works for Western cultures, but in non-Western cultures, culture matters. Doesn't indicate it necessarily. Okay. All right. How long have I been doing this? 26 minutes. Okay. All right. Persuasion by communication. On a day-to-day basis, we're all involved in the process of changing attitudes on TV, Facebook pages, YouTube, and Twitter, in pop-up ads, magazines, billboards. Advertisers flood us with ad campaigns designed to sell cars, soft drinks, credit cards, prescription drugs, new movies, and travel destinations. Likewise, politicians make speeches, run commercials, pass out bumper stickers, and kiss babies to win votes. Attitude change is sought whenever parents socialize their children, scientists advance theories and seek funding, religious groups seek converts, financial analysts recommend stocks, or trial lawyers argue their cases in court. Some appeals work, others do not. Some are soft and subtle, others are hard and blatant. Who remembers the "this is your brain on drugs"? Yeah. Some serve the public interest, whereas others serve commercial interests. The point is that there is nothing inherently evil or virtuous about changing attitudes. The process is known as persuasion. Okay. Highlight the process by which attitudes are changed. And yeah, I think I'm going to highlight there is nothing inherently evil or virtuous about changing attitudes. I think that's key. All right. If you wanted to change someone's attitude on an issue, you'd probably try to do it by making a persuasive communication. I'm going to highlight that. Appeals made in person, over the internet, or through mass media rely on spoken word. The written word and the image or video that is worth 1,000 words. What determines whether an appeal succeeds or fails? To understand why certain approaches are effective, whereas others are not, social psychologists have long sought to understand how and why persuasive communications work. For that, we need a roadmap of the persuasion process. Okay, so persuasive communication are appeals made in person, over the internet, through mass media, rely on the spoken word, written word, and image or video that's worth 1,000 words, I think is the most critical part of that. All right, let's move on. 2 roads to persuasion. It's a familiar scene in American politics. Every 4 years, 2 or more presidential candidates launch extensive and expensive campaigns for office. In a way, you've seen one election, you've seen them all. The names and dates may change, but over and over again, opposing candidates accuse each other of ducking substantive issues and turning the election into high-stakes, money-driven, name-calling, mudslinging popularity contests. True or not, these criticisms show that politicians are keenly aware that they can win votes through 2 different methods. They can stick to policy, issues, and a rational argumentation using the power of words, or they can base their appeals on other grounds. Interestingly, these other grounds can well determine who wins an election. What do I want to highlight from those first two sentences? Yeah, I don't think I need to. In The Political Brain, Drew Weston in 2007 presented a wealth of research evidence indicating that in the marketplace of politics, emotions overwhelm reason. Okay, that's going to be important, I have a feeling. Even if it's not, that's a dang good sentence. If you get nothing else out of that class, oh, that's potent. Why don't we learn that in poli-sci? Okay, anyway, from Make America Great Again to Build Bridges, Not Walls, real-world campaigns that appeal to emotion are not hard to identify. Based on a combination of laboratory experiments and public opinion polls, some of which are described by Weston, other political psychologists agree as to the impact of emotion. Outside the realm of politics, too, influence can be quick and automatic. In split-second persuasion, Kevin Dutton in 2010 described how Buddhist monks, magicians, advertisers, con artists, hostage negotiators, and other super persuaders use simplicity, empathy, an air of self-confidence, and other disarming tactics to effect instant persuasion. I think that's pretty potent. Super persuaders use simplicity, empathy, and an air of self-confidence, and other disarming tactics to effect instant persuasion. That's pretty potent. Okay. To account for these two alternative approaches to persuasion, Richard Petty and John Cacioppo in 1986 proposed a now classic dual process model of persuasion. This model assumes that we do not always process communications the same way. Evelyn, come and let Yuki in. Thank you. Okay, so this model, Evelyn, I need you to be quiet. Thank you. This model assumes that we do not always process communication the same way. When people think hard and critically about the contents of a message, they are said to take a central route to persuasion and are influenced by the strength and quality of the arguments. So that's a key term. The process by which a person thinks carefully about a communication and is influenced by the strength of its argument. When people do not think hard or critically about the contents of a message, but focus instead on other cues, they take a peripheral route to persuasion. Also another key term. The process by which a person does not think carefully about a communication and is influenced instead by superficial cues. As we'll see, the route taken depends on whether one is willing and able to scrutinize the information contained in the message itself. Over the years, this model has provided an important framework for understanding factors that elicit persuasion. I think that's going to be an important point as well. Yeah. Okay, so the central route. In the first systematic attempt to study persuasion, Carl Hovland and colleagues in 1949 and 1953 started the Yale Communication and Attitude Change Program. They proposed that for a persuasive message to have influence, the recipients of that message must learn its contents and be motivated to accept it. According to this view, people can be persuaded only by an argument if they attend to, comprehend, and retain in memory for later use. Whether the message takes the form of a live personal appeal, a newspaper editorial, a Sunday sermon, a TV commercial, or a pop-up window. These basic requirements remain the same. Okay, so I'm going to highlight. They proposed that for the persuasive message to have influence, recipients of the message must learn its contents and be motivated to accept it. Only by an argument they attend to, comprehend, and retain in memory for later use. Yeah. All right. A few years later, William McGuire in 1969 reiterated the information processing steps necessary for persuasion. Like the Yale group before him, he distinguished between the learning or reception of a message, a necessary first step, and its later acceptance. I have a feeling that's going to be important. Between the learning of the message, reception, and its later acceptance. Okay, in fact, McGuire in 1968 used this distinction to explain the surprising finding that a recipient's self-esteem and intelligence are unrelated to persuasion. In McGuire's analysis, these characteristics have opposite effects on reception and acceptance. People who are smart or high in self-esteem are better able to learn a message, but are less likely to accept its call for a change in attitude. Interesting. So the smarter you are, or the more you think of yourself, not in a negative way, but just more self-esteem you have, the less you tend to take on information, even if it's well thought out, very educative on that subject. Yeah, they're more willing. Okay. People who are less smart or low in self-esteem are more willing to accept the message, but they may have trouble learning its content. So people who are like, yeah, this makes sense, but they don't really learn what about it actually makes sense. Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to highlight that. People who are smart or high in self-esteem, and people who are less smart or low in self-esteem, all the way to the end, have trouble learning its contents. Overall, then, neither group is generally more vulnerable to persuasion than the other, a prediction that is supported by a good deal of research. Rhodes and Wood, 1992. Okay, so Anthony Greenwald in 1968 and others then argued that persuasion requires a third or intermediate step, which is elaboration. That's another key term. The process of thinking about and scrutinizing the arguments contained in the persuasive communication. To illustrate, imagine you're offered a job and your prospective employer tries to convince you over lunch to accept. You listen closely, you learn the terms of the offer, and understand what it means. But if it's a really important interview, your head will spin with questions as you weigh the pros and cons and contemplate the implications. What would it cost to move? Is there potential for advancement? Am I better off staying where I am? When confronted with personally significant messages, we don't listen merely to collect information. We also think about that information. When this happens, the message is effective to the extent that it leads us to focus on favorable rather than unfavorable thoughts. I think that's the most critical line in this whole thing. When confronted with personally significant messages, we don't merely listen to collect, we think about. The message is effective to the extent that it leads us to focus on favorable rather than unfavorable thoughts. These theories of attitude change, all share the assumption that the recipients of persuasive appeals are attentive, critical, and thoughtful of every word spoken. This assumption is correct some of the time. When it is, and when people consider a message carefully, their reaction to it depends on the strength of its contents. In these instances, messages have greater impact when they are easily learned rather than difficult, when they are memorable rather than forgettable, when they stimulate favorable rather than unfavorable elaboration. Ultimately, strong arguments are persuasive, weak arguments are not. Okay, so in this one, I'm going to highlight assumption that the recipients are attentive, critical, and thoughtful of every word. Strong arguments are persuasive and weak arguments aren't. On the central route to persuasion, the process is eminently rational. It's important to know, however, that thinking carefully about a persuasive message does not guarantee that the process is objective or that it necessarily promotes truth-seeking. At times, each of us prefers to hold a particular attitude and become biased in the way that we process that information. We've talked about that. Only collecting information from sources that we feel feed into what we believe rather than looking at all the information objectively. In one study, for example, college students who were politically conservative or liberal were more likely to agree with a social welfare plan and do so quickly, strongly, and persistently than when it was said to have the support of Democrats or Republicans, not according to logical merits of the policy itself. Interesting. Okay, so if you told someone who was conservative that a Republican suggested doing something, they were more likely to automatically jump in and say, yes, I agree with this plan, than if they were told it was a Democrat plan, not on the merits alone of the plan, just based on its affiliation. Yeah. I like that they've brought that up because it's not always rational how we collect our information. Okay, so in a second study, online participants reported their attitudes on a host of highly charged political issues. 3 days later, they were given an opportunity to browse from selection of newspaper articles that supported or opposed their positions. With the help of software that tracked everyone's browsing activity, the researchers found that participants spent 64% more time on articles that supported rather than opposed their existing attitudes. Yep. Okay, so from all of that, I think does not guarantee that the process is objective. Thinking carefully about a persuasive message, I should say, does not guarantee that the process is objective or that it necessarily promotes truth-seeking. The second sentence of that paragraph. And I think I'm going to highlight that little bit of this next sentence, biased in the way we process information. Yeah. Okay, so there is one additional complicating factor to consider. Several years ago, Petty and his colleagues in 2002 proposed the self-validation hypothesis, that people not only elaborate on a persuasive communication with positive or negative attitude-relevant thoughts, but they also seek to assess the validity of these thoughts. Those thoughts that we hold with high confidence will have a strong impact on our attitudes, as predicted by the dual process model of persuasion. But those we hold with low confidence will not have a strong impact on our attitudes. This means that various aspects of a persuasive communication, such as whether the source is a knowledgeable expert or whether the position advocated is one in which we agree or disagree, can affect the confidence we have in our own attitudes. All right, that sentence is the most critical. by far. Okay, so the next section, the peripheral route. We've talked about the central route, now the peripheral route. Okay, quote, the receptive ability of the masses is very limited, their understanding small. On the other hand, they have a great power of forgetting. Dang. The author of this cynical assessment of human nature was Adolf Hitler in 1933. I just read an Adolf Hitler quote. I don't like that. Believing, why do I have a feeling that he's going to make that important? Oh, I hate having to highlight this sentence. Oh. Yay. Believing that human beings are incompetent processors of information, Hitler relied on his propaganda, on the use of slogans, uniforms, swastika-covered flags, a special salute, and other symbols. For him, quote, meetings were not just occasions to make speeches. They were carefully planned theatrical productions in which settings, lighting, background music, and the timing of entrances were devised to maximize the emotional fervor of the audience. End quote. So do these ploys work? Can the masses be so handily manipulated into persuasion? History shows they can. Audiences are not always thoughtful. Sometimes people do not follow the central route to persuasion, but instead take a shortcut through the peripheral route. Rather than trying to learn about a message and think through the issues, they respond with little effort on the basis of superficial, peripheral cues. Yikes. The masses can be so handily manipulated into persuasion and instead take a shortcut through the peripheral route. They respond with little effort on the basis of superficial. Yeah. I think I'm going to mishmash those into one note about this paragraph. The masses can be handily manipulated into persuasion by instead taking a shortcut that involves little effort on the basis of superficial peripheral cues. I think that's what I'm going to type up in my notes. Yeah. Summarize. Okay. On the peripheral route to persuasion, people will often evaluate a communication by using simple-minded heuristics or rules of thumb. If a communicator has a good reputation, speaks fluently, or writes well, we tend to assume that his or her message is correct. And when speakers have a reputation for being honest, people think less critically about the contents of their communication. Likewise, we assume that a message must be correct if it contains a long litany of statistics or impressive lists of supporting experts. If it's familiar, if it elicits cheers from an audience, or even if the speaker seems to argue against his or her own interests. In some cases, people will change their attitudes simply because they know that an argument has majority support. Dang. I think all of these are examples, so if you want to put them as little bullet points of what we're about to highlight, you could. They're all really great examples, but I think the most important thing about that is that people will often evaluate the first sentence by using simple-minded heuristics or rules of thumb. On the mindless peripheral route, people are also influenced by factors that are not relevant to attitudes, such as cues from their own body movements. Several studies illustrate attitude embodiment effects. In one study, I'm just highlighting that attitude embodiment embodiment effects, just in case I need to find that quickly later while studying. In one study, participants were coaxed into nodding their heads up and down as if saying yes, or shaking their heads from side to side as if saying no, while they listened via headphones to an editorial, presumably to test whether the headphones could endure the physical activity. Those coaxed into nodding later agreed more with the arguments than those coaxed into shaking their heads from side to side. Damn. Okay. In other studies, participants viewed graphic symbols or word-like stimuli instead of using the word sure, like a word that looks similar to sure but isn't a word, or instead of using the word prime, using primate. I've never seen that, but they're using that example. Yeah, if they viewed these graphic symbols or word-like stimuli while using an exercise bar to either stretch their arms out, which mimics what we do to push something away, or to flex their arms in, which we do to bring something closer. Participants later judged these stimuli to be more pleasant when they were associated with flexing the arm than when they were associated with a stretching out motion. Yeah, that's powerful. The unconscious cues that we have psychologically to bringing something in or assenting to someone or something. Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, so now they're going to talk about route selection, which route you usually select. Thanks to Petty and Kakiopo's 1986 two-track distinction between the central and peripheral routes, it's easy to understand why the persuasion process seems so logical on some occasions, yet so illogical on others. Why voters may select candidates according to issues or images, why juries may base their verdicts on evidence or the defendant's appearance, and why consumers may base their purchases on marketing reports or on a product's images. The process that is engaged depends on whether the recipients of a persuasive message have the ability and the motivation to take the central route, or whether they rely on peripheral cues instead. I think that's the most important one. Yep. The process depends. All the way to the end. Yep, that's the most important. To understand the conditions that lead people to process information on one route or the other, it's helpful to view persuasive communication as the outcome of three factors: a source, who; a message, what, in what context; and an audience, to whom. Each of these factors steers a recipient's approach to the communication. If a source speaks clearly, if the message is important, or if there's a bright, captive, an involved audience that cares deeply about the issue and has time to absorb the information, then audience members will be willing and able to take the effortful central route. But if the source speaks at a rate that's too fast to comprehend, if the message is too trivial or complex to process, if the audience members are distracted or pressed for time or uninterested, then the less strenuous peripheral route is taken. I don't know if anybody else, sorry, my husband is making messages that my classmates can read. Please don't. Sorry. Yeah, I think we can all relate to this. Having gone through this class and knowing how many different professors teach, and if a message is too difficult to take in or someone is making it difficult to follow a pattern of the class, then people check out. They're just going to check out, and it makes it more difficult to retain that information if it's just easier to go, you know what, I'll just look at the cliff notes of this because it's too hard. Yeah, damn, that's relevant. Okay, so I'm going to highlight 3 factors: source, message, and audience. Yeah. Okay, so they talk about in figure 6.7, it presents a roadmap of persuasive communication. And then in the next 3 sections, we follow this roadmap from the input factors: source, message, audience, through a central or peripheral processing route to reach a final destination, which is the persuasion. Okay, I am going to take a break because this is a good stopping point. I was going to try to get one more page to get even, but this is a good stopping point. And then I will do my studying for today because I only just caught up. Oh, Lord. I was so distracted last time. Sorry, guys. Thanks for joining. I will see you a little later tonight. Okay, bye.